She was 19 years old, and for all intents and purposes, homeless. She had no family left to speak of, no money to fill a pocket, and no plan other than the one foot she was determined to place in front of the other. All she owned was a blacksmith's hammer, with a hickory handle worn smooth by a dead man's grip, and the $20 she'd been given for the sale of his tools. And with that $20, she bought the salvage rights to an abandoned freight wagon wrecked in the bottom of Red Creek Canyon. But what nobody in the town of Providence knew, what they couldn't see as they mocked her from the canyon rim, was that beneath the wagon's splintered floorboards lay a secret that would unmake the man who cast her out and build her a life from the wreckage. Settle in close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Dinah Boone was not born to the red dust of Utah territory, but to the damp, dark soil of Missouri, a place she remembered only in flashes of green and the smell of thunderstorms. Her parents had died of cholera on the trail west when she was 5, their names and faces worn away by time, until only the fact of their absence remained. She was taken in by a distant cousin in the fledgling settlement of Providence, a man whose charity was as thin and brittle as winter ice. For 10 years, she was a shadow in his house, an extra mouth to feed, a pair of hands for chores that were always the dirtiest. She learned silence and observation, how to make herself small, and how to read the intentions of men in the set of their jaws. Her only solace was Jedediah Croft, the town blacksmith. He was a widower, a man whose hands were maps of soot and calluses, but whose eyes were clear and kind. He saw the girl who lingered by his forge, watching the magic of iron and fire, and he recognized the steady focus in her gaze. He began to teach her, first simple things like banking the coals and working the bellows, then the more complex arts of drawing out steel, folding it, quenching it, and feeling the temper in the ring of a hammer strike. He taught her that every piece of metal had a memory, and every piece of wood a grain, and that a person with patience could learn to read both. He gave her a small hammer he'd forged himself, its head perfectly balanced, its handle shaped for her hand. It was the first thing anyone had ever made just for her, and she kept it with her always, a solid, tangible piece of affection in a life that had offered little of it. When Jedediah died of a lung fever that winter, the last buffer between Dinah and the cold judgment of Providence was gone. The town was run by Bishop Thorne, a man whose piety was a cloak for his avarice. He saw a young, unattached woman occupying a valuable smithy on a prime piece of land, and he saw an opportunity. Dinah knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the quiet cruelties of powerful men, that her time in the shelter of the forge was running out. Jedediah had been her protector, her teacher, her only real family, and his legacy was not just the skill in her hands, but the small hammer she now clutched, its weight a constant, grounding reminder of the one person who had seen her as something more than a burden. The end came not with a shout, but with the rustle of a paper. Bishop Thorne did not come to the smithy himself. He sent his clerk, a pale young man with ink-stained fingers who refused to meet Dinah's eyes. He stood in the doorway, the scent of coal dust and quenching steam swirling around him, and held out a ledger sheet. It was, he explained in a hushed monotone, a tally of debts owed by the late Jedediah Croft to the town tithing office and to Thorne's own mercantile. The figures were a fiction, a column of invented loans for tools and supplies Dinah knew for a fact Jedediah had either forged himself or paid for in cash. The total was a sum so impossibly large it could never be repaid by a girl with nothing. At the bottom, in the bishop's elegant script, was an offer. In exchange for forgiving this fabricated debt, the deed to the smithy and the adjoining lot would be transferred to the bishop's name. She was given 24 hours to vacate the premises. There was no room for argument. The paper was an edict, as cold and final as a gravestone. Dinah did not plead or weep. She had learned long ago that such displays only gratified men like Thorne. She simply nodded, took the paper, and closed the heavy oak door. The rest of that day was a quiet ritual of letting go. She cleaned the forge, sweeping the years of accumulated dust and iron filings into a neat pile. She oiled Jedediah's tools, the big rounding hammer, the flatters and fullers, the tongs he had shaped for every conceivable task, and arranged them on the rack where they belonged. A man from the mercantile came to inventory them, his eyes lingering on the Peter Wright anvil that was the heart of the shop. He offered her $20 for the lot, a pittance, but it was more than nothing. She took the money without haggling. She packed a small canvas sack with a change of clothes, a skillet, a small bag of flour, a tin of coffee, and a block of matches. She wrapped Jedediah's hammer in an oilcloth and tucked it deep inside. As the sun set, casting long, sharp shadows across the dirt street, she walked out of the only home she had ever truly known, leaving the door unlocked behind her. She did not look back. The cruelty was not in the taking, but in the sterile, administrative way it was done. A life erased by a few strokes of a pen on a ledger. She walked toward the edge of town, the $20 a small, cold weight in her pocket. She walked south, away from the orderly grid of Providence and into the wild, broken country that fell away into the canyons. The journey was not long in miles, but profound in its transition. The air grew drier, the scent of wood smoke and livestock giving way to the clean, sharp smell of sagebrush and sun-baked sandstone. The road dissolved into a dusty track that wound its way down the long, sloping escarpment, and with each step, the world of men felt more distant. She moved with a steady, unhurried pace, her eyes not on the horizon but on the ground before her, reading the land as Jedediah had taught her to read iron. She noted the way the junipers clung to the north-facing slopes, the patterns of erosion that spoke of ancient floods, the faint tracks of a coyote that had passed that morning. This was not a landscape of gentle comforts. It was a place of stark, honest beauty that demanded respect and attention. By late afternoon, she reached the floor of Red Creek Canyon. The walls rose up on either side, sheer cliffs of crimson and ochre rock layered like pages in a great stone book. The creek itself was a thin, life-giving ribbon of green, lined with cottonwoods whose leaves shimmered in the slightest breeze. The silence was immense, broken only by the buzz of insects and the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. She found what she was looking for a mile downstream, a small dugout, little more than a cave carved into the hard-packed earth of a cut bank. Likely an old line shack for a stockman long since gone. The roof was a lattice of juniper logs covered with soil and sod, and a crude stone chimney stood at one end. It was abandoned and crumbling, but it was shelter. She swept it out with a branch, her movements methodical and calm. She gathered dry wood, started a small, efficient fire in the stone hearth, and made a simple meal of fried dough and black coffee. As dusk filled the canyon, turning the red rock to a deep, bruised purple, she sat on a flat stone by the creek, the small hammer resting in her lap. She felt not despair, but a quiet, bracing clarity. She had been ejected from one life, and now she had to begin another, here, in this place of stone and silence. The fatigue of the day settled into her bones, a deep, satisfying ache. She had moved. She had survived. And as she watched the first stars appear in the sliver of sky above the canyon rim, she knew that tomorrow she would work. The next morning, while exploring the canyon floor for resources, she found it. The freight wagon was wedged sideways in a deep, sandy washout about a quarter-mile from her dugout. Its back axle snapped clean and its tongue splintered. It had clearly been there for some time, at least through one winter and a summer. The canvas cover was long gone, rotted away to a few tattered strips that fluttered in the breeze. The paint on the sideboards was peeled and bleached by the sun, but she could still make out the faint lettering of a Salt Lake City freight company. It was a wreck, a piece of forgotten junk to anyone else. To the people of Providence, who occasionally rode the trail along the canyon rim, it was a landmark of failure, a reminder of some long-forgotten accident. But Dinah saw something else. She ran her hand over the iron tires, noting they were still sound, pitted with rust but not deeply corroded. She examined the hubs and the remaining spokes, seeing the tight grain of good hickory. The sideboards were oak, weathered but not rotten, and the wagon bed itself, though filled with sand and debris, was made of thick, solid planks. She saw hinges and brackets, bolts and braces, a treasure trove of forged iron that could be heated and reshaped. She saw lumber that could reinforce her dugout, build a door, a table, a cot. She saw not a wreck, but a kit of raw materials. The challenge was its location. It was deeply mired in the wash, weighing well over 1,000 pounds, and the bank leading up to the flat ground by her camp was steep and loose. It was a task for a team of mules and 3 strong men. Dinah had only herself. She spent the rest of the day planning, her mind working with the familiar calculus of leverage and mechanics that Jedediah had taught her. She returned to the dugout and retrieved a length of rope from her pack and began fashioning what she needed from the landscape itself, her hands sure and competent. She found a sturdy deadfall cottonwood and, using her belt axe, spent hours shaping it into a thick, functional lever. She scouted the bank for solid anchor points, a deep-rooted juniper, a protrusion of solid rock. The problem was not one of brute strength, but of patience and physics. That evening, she walked back into Providence, her face set. She went to the mercantile and used 10 of her $20 to purchase 2 pulleys and 50 feet of thick hemp rope. The clerk gave her a curious look, but she offered no explanation. She spent her last $10 on a sack of flour, beans, and a side of salt pork. She was investing everything she had in this wreckage. She was all in. Her work began at dawn. Over the next 2 days, the canyon became a theater of quiet, relentless labor, with Dinah as the sole actor and the town of Providence as her unwitting audience. Riders on the rim trail would stop, watch for a while, and sometimes shout down mockingly. "That wagon's been there a year, girl," one man yelled, his laughter echoing off the rock walls. "What do you think you're going to do with it?" She never looked up, never acknowledged them. Her focus was absolute. She rigged a block and tackle, anchoring one pulley to the stoutest root of the juniper tree high on the bank and the other to the wagon's front axle. She used her cottonwood pole as a capstan, driving it deep into the ground and winding the rope around it, gaining precious mechanical advantage. It was a slow, grueling process. She would dig the sand and rock away from the wheels, then winch the rope, straining with every muscle in her back and arms. The wagon would groan, shift, and move a few inches, the sound of splintering wood and scraping metal sharp in the canyon silence. Then she would reset her anchors, re-rig the capstan, and begin again. Inch by inch, foot by foot, she coaxed the massive wreck up the sandy slope. Her hands were raw, her muscles screaming with effort, but her movements were economical and precise. She worked through the heat of the day, taking breaks only to drink from the creek and chew on a piece of hardtack. On the evening of the second day, with a final shuddering lurch, the wagon cleared the lip of the bank and settled onto the flat ground near her camp. She stood for a long moment, hands on her hips, breathing heavily, covered in dust and sweat, and looked at her prize. The mocking voices from the rim had fallen silent. The next morning, she began the careful work of disassembly. She started with the wagon bed, intending to use the thick oak planks to build a proper door and floor for her dugout. She used a small pry bar she'd found in Jedediah's things to work the first board loose. It was held by heavy, square-headed bolts, and as she pried, she noticed something strange. The floorboards were unusually thick, nearly 3 inches, and they didn't sit directly on the cross members of the frame. There was a gap, Her curiosity piqued. She worked more carefully, tapping along the wood with her hammer, listening to the sound. Near the front, the sound was different, hollow. She examined the joinery. It was too fine, too precise for a simple cargo floor. It was the work of a cabinet maker, not a Wainwright. Running her fingers along a seam between two planks, she felt a small, almost invisible indentation. She pressed it, and a section of the floor, about 4 feet square, lifted with a soft click. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She lifted the heavy panel away. Beneath it lay a hidden compartment, a false bottom, lined with dark felt. And nestled inside was a sight that made her forget her aching muscles, the mocking laughter, and the gnawing loneliness of the past few days. The contents of the hidden compartment were laid out with a traveler's careful precision. There were 5 long bundles wrapped in oilcloth and tied with leather thongs. A heavy, iron-banded express box, small but dense, bore the stenciled mark of Wells, Fargo and Company, and beside it, protected in a worn leather satchel, was a thin ledger book. Dinah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the nearest oilcloth bundle. She untied the thong and unrolled the stiff, waxy fabric. Inside, resting on a bed of raw wool, was a rifle. It was unlike any she had ever seen. The stock was a deep, swirling walnut, polished to a satin sheen. The barrel was octagonal, its blued steel finish a deep, liquid black. The lockplate and hammer were engraved with delicate scrollwork, a testament to hundreds of hours of patient, skilled work. She knew enough from Jedediah to recognize master craftsmanship. She unwrapped the other 4 bundles. Each held a rifle of similar quality, each a unique piece of functional art. These were not standard-issue weapons. They were custom-built firearms for wealthy clients, worth a fortune. She turned her attention to the express box. It was locked, but the lock was simple. Using the tip of a file and a small piece of iron wire, she carefully picked it, the tumblers falling into place with a series of satisfying clicks. She lifted the heavy lid. The box was filled to the brim with gold coins. Double eagles, minted in San Francisco, their surfaces gleaming in the morning sun. It was more money than she had ever seen, more money than most people in Providence would see in a lifetime. Finally, she opened the leather satchel. Inside was a shipping manifest and a driver's log, the ink written in a neat, steady hand. She sat on the ground, leaning against a wagon wheel, and began to read. The manifest listed the cargo: 5 custom sporting rifles, commissioned by the U.S. Department of the Interior. 1 Wells Fargo Express box containing $5,000 gold coin, payment for said rifles. The destination was the U.S. Army garrison at Fort Cameron. The sender was a gunsmith in Salt Lake City named Elias Thorne. The consignee, the man who was to receive the shipment and arrange its final transport, was his brother, Bishop Alistair Thorne of Providence. The driver's name was listed at the top, Silas Kane. The last entry in his log was dated over a year ago. It read, "Entering Red Creek Canyon, Bishop Thorne to meet me at the south end." A cold dread settled in Dinah's stomach. She remembered the whispers from a year back. Talk of a government shipment gone missing, a driver vanished, presumed robbed and killed by bandits in the canyons. Bishop Thorne himself had led the search party, which had, of course, found nothing. He had publicly mourned the loss, blaming the lawlessness of the territory. But the evidence was here, in her hands. Thorne hadn't been the victim of a robbery. He had been the architect of one. He had staged the whole thing, murdered the driver, Silas Kane, and shoved the wagon into the washout, never imagining anyone would have the strength or the foolishness to drag it out. The discovery shifted everything. The wagon was no longer just salvage, it was a crime scene. The rifles were not just valuable, they were evidence. The gold was not just wealth, it was leverage. Dinah spent the rest of the day in quiet, deliberate action. She rewrapped the rifles and placed them back in the compartment. She closed the express box and slid it into the deepest corner of her dugout, covering it with a pile of firewood. The manifest and logbook she wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside her shirt, the stiff paper a constant, secret reminder against her skin. Her first priority was to transform her camp from a temporary shelter into a defensible home. The world had suddenly become a more dangerous place. She worked with a focused intensity, using the thick oak planks from the wagon bed. With a saw and brace and bit salvaged from Jedediah's tools, she fashioned a heavy, solid door for the dugout, fitting it into a frame she built from the wagon's sideboards. She forged hinges from an iron tire, heating the metal in her small hearth fire and shaping it on a flat, heavy rock that served as a makeshift anvil. Jedediah's hammer felt like an extension of her own arm, its familiar weight and balance guiding her hands. The rhythmic clang of steel on steel was a comforting, defiant sound in the canyon silence. She used the remaining lumber to build a floor, raising it slightly off the dirt to keep out the damp. She built a simple cot, a small table, and shelves. By the end of the week, the crumbling dugout had become a snug, fortified cabin, its entrance barred by a door that could withstand a battering ram. As she worked, she felt a change in the air. The story of her single-handed salvage of the wagon had spread through Providence. The mockery had turned to a grudging, curious respect. One afternoon, a freighter named Abram, a man whose face was a roadmap of desert sun and wind, stopped his team on the rim trail. He didn't say a word, just unhitched a barrel of fresh water from his wagon, lowered it down the bank with a rope, and left it for her. A few days later, a widow named Martha Jessup, a woman who lived on the edge of town and kept to herself, made her way down the trail into the canyon. She carried a steaming pot of rabbit stew. She said very little, just looked at the work Dinah had done, the solid door, the neat stack of firewood, and nodded in approval. "A body needs a decent meal when they're working this hard," was all she said. Dinah thanked her, and the next day walked into town and used a piece of the wagon's iron to forge a new latch for Martha's broken garden gate, the work clean and strong. These were the first threads of community, woven not with words of friendship, but with quiet acts of practical exchange and mutual respect. Her position began to solidify, not through any declaration, but through the steady application of her craft. People from the outskirts of Providence, those who felt the bishop's influence less keenly, began to seek her out. A farmer with a broken plowshare, a rancher needing new brands forged, a mother with a kettle that had lost its handle. They would leave the broken item by her camp with a small payment of food, a sack of potatoes, a clutch of eggs, a slab of bacon. Dinah would do the work, her repairs strong and honest, and leave the mended item in the same spot for them to collect. Her name was spoken with a new weight. She was no longer the orphan girl, the outcast. She was Dinah Boone, the smith at Red Creek. She was becoming a part of the place, her identity forged as surely as the iron she worked. But the knowledge of what lay hidden in her dugout was a heavy burden. She knew she couldn't keep it secret forever. Bishop Thorne was a powerful man, and if he ever suspected what she had found, her life would be in danger. She needed an ally, someone outside the bishop's sphere of control. Her chance came with the monthly arrival of Elias Vance, the U.S. Marshal for the territory. He was a tall, weary-looking man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. He rode into Providence, his jurisdiction covering thousands of square miles of unforgiving country. Dinah waited until he was leaving town, intercepting him on the trail that led past the canyon rim. She stood in the middle of the track, forcing him to rein in his horse. He looked down at the young woman, her face smudged with soot, her hands calloused, and his expression was one of wary annoyance. "What is it, miss?" "Marshal," she said, her voice steady. "I have something you need to see." He was skeptical, but something in her direct, unflinching gaze made him dismount. She led him down the steep path to her camp. He took in the scene, the dismantled wagon, the fortified dugout, the small, efficient forge. With a practiced, assessing eye, inside her small home, she unwrapped one of the rifles and laid it on the table. The marshal's eyes widened. He picked it up, his hands moving over it with an expert's appreciation. "This is Elias Thorne's work," he said, his voice low. "The gunsmith from Salt Lake. There's not another man in the territory who can do this." "There are 4 more like it," Dinah said. Then she laid the manifest and Silas Kane's logbook on the table beside the rifle. The marshal read the document slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. He remembered the case of the missing shipment. It had been a loose end, a puzzle that had bothered him. Now the pieces were clicking into place. He looked from the papers to Dinah. "Where did you get this?" "From the false bottom of that wagon," she said, gesturing outside. "The one Bishop Thorne said was robbed by bandits." The marshal was silent for a long time, the implications settling heavily in the small room. He looked at the girl before him, young, alone, yet possessed of a formidable will. She had not only uncovered a crime, but had built a life from its leavings. "You've put yourself in a great deal of danger, Miss Boone." "I know," she said simply. "That's why I'm talking to you." The marshal sat in Dinah's small, solid cabin, the rifle across his knees and the manifest in his hand, and he made a decision. He had dealt with men like Bishop Thorne before, men who used faith as a shield and power as a weapon. They were often the hardest to bring down, their roots sunk deep into the community. But the evidence Dinah had uncovered was irrefutable. A signed manifest, a dead driver's last entry, and the physical cargo Thorne claimed had been stolen. It was a clean, straight line to a conviction. "I'll need your testimony," he said, his voice flat and official. "And I'll need these items as evidence." Dinah nodded. "They're safer with you than with me." Marshal Vance made his arrangements quietly. He deputized Abram, the freighter, and 2 other men from outside Providence who owed no loyalty to the bishop. They rode into town not at midday, when the streets were full, but in the gray light of dawn. They went directly to Bishop Thorne's large stone house that stood beside the church. Dinah remained at her camp in the canyon, as the marshal had instructed, but Abram's son had ridden out to tell her what was happening. She stood by her forge, the air cool and still, and watched the smoke rise from the town's chimneys, imagining the scene. The confrontation, she later heard, was quiet. The bishop, roused from his sleep, was full of righteous indignation until the marshal laid the manifest on his polished dining table. Thorne's face went pale. He saw the name of the driver, Silas Kane, and his own brother's signature, and he knew he was undone. He offered no resistance as the marshal placed him under arrest for grand larceny, mail fraud, and suspicion of murder. The news spread through Providence like a grass fire. The bishop's arrest created a power vacuum, and the townspeople, freed from his oppressive influence, began to speak openly of his land grabs, his unfair business practices, and his heavy-handed rule. With Thorne gone, the town seemed to take a collective breath. A few weeks later, Dinah received an official letter from the territorial court. As the finder of the abandoned wagon and its contents, she was legally awarded title to it all. The rifles were returned to her, logged as evidence, but hers to keep. The Wells Fargo box containing the $5,000 in gold was delivered to her by Marshal Vance himself. She was, in an instant, one of the wealthiest individuals in the region. She used the money first to buy the smithy, the deed signed over by a flustered town clerk. She walked back into the place, the scent of cold iron and coal dust welcoming her like an old friend. She spent the next months restoring it, not changing it, but bringing it back to life. Her life, with the resources she had earned. She was no longer an outcast. She was an anchor. People came to her not just for mending, but for advice. Her judgment, like her ironwork, was sound and true. She had a place. She had a name. She had a home. Dinah Boone stood in the wide doorway of the smithy, the early morning light slanting across the hard-packed dirt floor. The air was cool and carried the familiar, comforting smell of the banked coals in the forge, a scent she now associated not with loss, but with purpose. Her hands, clean but forever marked by the soot and calluses of her trade, rested on the worn oak of the doorframe. Inside, the shop was alive. The tools were arranged on the racks, not as museum pieces, but as instruments waiting for the day's work. The great Peter Wright anvil stood solid in the center of the room, its surface scarred and beautiful from a lifetime of service. On the workbench against the far wall, two objects sat side by side. One was the small, perfectly balanced hammer Jedediah Croft had made for her, its hickory handle glowing with the patina of use and affection. It was a tool of creation, a symbol of the quiet love and practical knowledge a good man had given her. Beside it lay one of the custom rifles made by Elias Thorne, the gunsmith from Salt Lake. It was a tool of destruction, but also a thing of exquisite craftsmanship, the physical proof of a crime that had led to her salvation. It represented another craftsman, another brother, betrayed by the man who had cast her out. She thought of Silas Kane, the driver, whose last written words had been his own unwitting death sentence. In a way, he had been her hidden benefactor, leaving her a legacy he never intended, a map to justice written in a simple logbook. She had become the unlikely executor of his last delivery. The town of Providence had settled into a new rhythm without Bishop Thorne. It was quieter, perhaps, but more honest. People looked each other in the eye. Abram the freighter now stopped at the smithy on every trip, sharing a cup of coffee and news from the wider world. Martha Jessup brought her fresh bread every Saturday. Dinah Boone was 19 years old and had been homeless. She'd had $20 to her name, and she had spent half of it on the salvage rights to a wrecked wagon that everyone else saw as junk. It was the best $10 she had ever spent. We hope this story found you well. If it resonated with you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who appreciates a story of quiet strength. And for our question tonight, what have you found value in that others have overlooked? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one.